So we will be talking today, again, part 2 of the beast and the mark of the beast. And as you'll remember from last time, we really, to understand Revelation 13 and the beasts that are there are 2 beasts, one that comes up out of the water and one that comes up out of the land. In order to understand that, we really needed to go back to the book of Daniel, which John would have been very familiar with the book of Daniel, and God uses some of the same imagery, much the same imagery that he used back in Daniel in Revelation. And so we're going to have a few slides here, and I'm going to talk about just review very quickly. Daniel chapter 2, we talked about the image of the giant man with a head of gold. And it was revealed to Daniel. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to say anything about it, what he had dreamed. Whoever revealed the dream had to reveal what, not only the dream, but also what it symbolized. And the hard part for most people was, who can tell you what you dreamed? They wanted Nebuchadnezzar to tell them, and then they would interpret it, of course. But he had this dream of the fine head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And of course, that represents the Babylonian Empire, of which Nebuchadnezzar was head. And after Nebuchadnezzar, the Medo-Persian Empire took over. And after that, the Greek Empire took over. And after that, we know the Romans did. Now, part of this prophecy of Daniel involves him telling Nebuchadnezzar the succeeding empire. Sometimes Daniel would name that empire, the Persians, the Medo-Persians. And of course, Daniel lived on into the time that empire took over. So these were successive empires. And we went over to Daniel chapter 7, and we see another, and I think if it's on back behind me, you probably see several images, artist renditions of this head of gold and that man. In Daniel chapter 7, we reviewed the idea that Daniel himself had a dream, and in that dream he saw a lion. And the lion had had an eagle's wings. And again, we associate that first beast with Babylon, a lion with eagle's wings. And then the next image is that of a bear with three ribs in its mouth. And we recognize that, of course, the next empire, coinciding with Daniel 2, is the Persian Empire, the bear. And then we came to the leopard with 4 heads. And that we represent, of course, a leopard being very fast, very swift, and having 4 wings and 4 heads. We represent that with Greece and Alexander the Great, who was very quick to conquer the known world. And by the time he was 33, he didn't have any place else to conquer. And of course, he died early, and he left his kingdom, quote, to the strongest. And so various generals fought for control. They ended up settling into 4 kingdoms, 4 rulers of various parts of his kingdom. 4 generals took over, hence the 4 heads in that particular case, and the leopard. And finally, we come to the 4th beast. It's not mentioned as a lion or a bear or a leopard. It's just a beast. And I think it's important to keep in mind that just because it says beast, it doesn't necessarily mean it's something heinous. But it must have been something he hadn't seen before, because otherwise he could have associated this beast with an animal. It says he saw in the night visions a 4th beast, exceedingly strong, teeth of iron, and it devoured, broken in pieces, and trampled the residue, and it had 10 horns. So again, we have artist renditions of this particular beast and what it might have looked like. I think it will be interesting when we meet Daniel in the future to see, can you draw what you saw? And see if it met anything close to our imagination. I've got a slide with the 4 different beasts, and you'll notice the 4th one looks more like a dinosaur with the 10 horns going across its back. I've always pictured it more like we traditionally saw it, but who knows what Daniel saw in those visions. But again, it grieved him, and he was seeing the kingdoms of the world that would succeed after Nebuchadnezzar, all the way up. This final beast with the 10 horns, we recognize being the horns representing 10 successive kingdoms that would come into play. And so we see that historically. In fact, and I mentioned this last time, the idea of the identity of these empires is not something that's very much questioned. Everybody pretty well agrees that these are the empires that came along. And so we started reading then in Revelation 13. If you want to just go ahead and turn there, we'll just pick up Revelation chapter 13, which really is a compilation of the images that we saw in Daniel 2 and Daniel chapter 7. We see much of that same imagery here. And so it just makes sense that God would use that same imagery and show Daniel another vision. He sees it in a little different of a way, but still we have much the same composition there. Revelation chapter 13, I should say. And I think I had a slide with the empires, Babylon and all, and how long they lasted. Of course, we recognize that the Roman Empire, that fourth one, would be something that would die, would have a deadly wound, and it would be overtaken, but then it would come back. And we talked about that some with the young adults at the young adult retreat, about how that happened and the various empires that came along that became the Holy Roman Empire. The deadly wound, as it's talked about, was healed. And all the way up until today, we find people still talking about Rome. The legacy of the Empire of Rome, and that legacy lives today. And the allure of it lives on today. When they signed the Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, the comment was made, we feel like Romans today. So that spirit is alive and well today, and we expect one final revival of what's associated with that original Roman Empire in Europe before Christ comes back. So let's pick up then Revelation 13. Continuing on, I'll just go through this very quickly since we've already reviewed it. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on those horns 10 crowns. And so these 7 heads are something we've already seen referred to in Daniel 7. The 10 horns as well. And verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were that of a bear, the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power. And so these are talking about these worldly kingdoms, these political, military powers that would arise after Nebuchadnezzar and be on the scene, and specifically those who would have an impact on the Israelite people. It's not concerning itself with what's going on in the eastern parts of the world that don't have an impact on God's people, but those who are controlling the land of the Holy Land and such. Notice it says that the dragon gave it its power. We have to keep in mind that behind these worldly kingdoms, there is a satanic force. Sometimes these kingdoms and the laws can, of course, do good things and bring order and such, but ultimately it is Satan that has control, and particularly at the end, when we see that Satan directly guides much of what happens, the beast power at the end. Notice it says, verse 3, and I saw one of its heads had been mortally wounded, and the deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled. Of course, we recognize that with the fall of the Roman Empire, at least the western portion of the empire located in Rome. We had the barbarians come in and overtake Rome and control the empire. They divided it up, of course. It was the end of the Roman Empire as they knew it, at least there in Rome. But eventually, a few decades later, Justinian established the imperial restoration, 554 AD, which was the deadly wound being healed. So again, people oftentimes with regard to Daniel's prophecies think that someone else must have written it much later to have such accuracy. But in this case, John is writing about something that was yet to happen in the future. The Roman Empire that existed at the time of John, as powerful as it was an empire that could never come to an end, but it did. And it had a mortal wound, it was healed, and the world marveled at that. Verse 4, and they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast and who is able to make war with him?" And so we talked about Satan being behind this. We talked about the power of that particular empire through the ages. And then we read about in verse 5, "And there was a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue 42 months. And this verse we understand referring to even the involvement of the false religious system that became involved, particularly with the Holy Roman Empire and the resurrections, revivals of that empire through the ages. And then verse 6 says, "He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. And it was granted him to make war with the saints, to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." And of course, we recognize this to be a period of time that even the church was persecuted through the Dark Ages and Middle Ages. And the Catholic Church was much behind that persecution of those who did not go along with their doctrines. The blasphemy, it says he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. I mean, you think about any person who would say they stand in the place of Jesus. And that's what the popes claimed early on, in the place of Jesus. And to be able to change laws and to say that we should do things that the Bible doesn't say, contrary to Scripture. It's pretty blasphemous. Verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed by the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. So that's kind of where we held off last time. And we're going to pick up in verse 11 now, continuing on. The first beast that we saw rising up out of the water represented a state, a political entity, and a military power. We're going to get into verse 11 here. It's going to be another beast rising up, this time out of the earth. It says, "Then I saw," in verse 11, "another beast coming up out of the earth." The first one came up out of the waters, which we know in other Revelation 17 pictures the peoples of the world. But this is coming up out of the earth, perhaps symbolizing the idea that it's a very earthly, worldly, as opposed to heavenly type thing. Because it's important, because it goes on to say it had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Now, this idea of a lamb, elsewhere in the book of Revelation, it refers to Christ. Nothing else but to Christ. But in this particular case, it says like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. And then Satan is referred to as a dragon, Revelation 12:9, other places. So we see here a contrast. It seems to be religious, seems to be representing Christ, but it speaks like a dragon. These horns, having two horns, we've understood that probably as referring to the separation of the Catholic Church from the Greek Orthodox Church many years ago. There were two branches of that, similar to the fact that there became later on in the Roman Empire two branches, one at Rome and one at Constantinople. And it was the one at Constantinople, Justinian, that reestablished the Western Empire at Rome. So there's these two aspects of it that perhaps at the time of the end will combine into one church again. But this represents, it seems like it's a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. And there's also the concept, though, that goes along with this idea of two horns. Horns oftentimes represent power in the Bible. And it's interesting that the Catholic Church, over the course of many generations, have had both the religious governance, but also had very much of an impact and a say in what happened politically in the world. Kind of dabbling very much into the politics of the world. So there's been those two aspects, both religious authority, but they have had a certain amount of civil authority too. Perhaps that's what those two horns might symbolize as well. Continuing on then, in verse 12, "But he exercises all the authority of the first beast," that's the Roman Empire, the secular empire, "in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in the earth to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. Now, I think ultimately we're talking here about what happens at the time of the end. Not to say this hasn't happened historically as well, but ultimately we're getting to the time of the end. It says, cause it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. It's interesting that the idea back in the first verse, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. The Nelson Study Bible says the word another means another of the same kind. Another of the same kind. A very close relationship between this beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. And so, based on the actions of this beast described here and in Revelation 16, verse 13, and Revelation 19, we come to the conclusion this certainly would be a false religious system. Down in verse 13 then, he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now, we'll pause right there and think about this. Who else at the time of the very end is causing fire to come down from heaven? We know the two witnesses can do that as well. And it's going to be a very confusing time, I think, for the world to have two opposing forces here. You've got the two witnesses, you've got the false prophet, this false religious system. Both are able to do miracles. If we didn't have what's written here in Revelation and Daniel, put all this together, we could easily be deceived because they're both doing great signs and wonders. And I'm sure the world is going to be very deceived by this. Notice it goes on to say in verse 14, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. So there's great deception that happens, and we have to keep in mind that this false prophet, this false religious system is going to be drawing attention and allegiance toward a governmental system, a final resurrected Roman Empire that will exist. There's going to be a close relationship between them. Now, we also understand from prophecy that at the very end, there seems to be a separation. And the state goes after the church at the very end. But at this point, early on at the end time, there's a close correlation between them. How do we know if these people are both are working miracles? Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 13. It's an important warning here for us in Deuteronomy chapter 13 that we're going to need to keep in mind to be able to ascertain who's in the right, who's in the wrong, to make sure that we're not deceived the same way that so many will be. Deuteronomy chapter 13 contains a principle that we're going to have to consider. Beginning in verse 1, if there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, now that's going to be happening at that time. It says it gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder comes to pass. Wow. Not only is there the sign and wonder, but what they prophesy to happen actually happens. Well, that's got to be godly, right? So many in the world will think that. But notice it says, and the sign and wonder comes to pass, of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known. Let us serve them. Here is a key. Where, in this case, this false religious system is setting itself up to something that can be venerated, asking us to worship the image of the beast instead of God, to give allegiance to. Now, whether this is something where they're asking people to actually bow down to, I'm not sure how that will work, but it will be giving allegiance to this false system that the dragon controls. It's saying, let us go after other gods and serve them. There's idolatry involved. Certainly we see that concept in Revelation 13. The worship of the beast, the image of the beast, is certainly idolatry there. And emperor worship was something that happened many, many times in the Roman Empire. People were expected to worship the emperor. And even the true Christians were originally singled out and persecuted because they refused. They didn't care if they worshiped their other gods, but they had to, at least when they were called on, sacrifice to the emperor. And they refused to do it, and that caused many of them to be persecuted. So continuing on here, it says, saying to you, let us go after other gods which you have not known. Let us serve them. Verse 3, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So it's going to be a test. It will be a test for us as well. Will we recognize the true prophet, the true miracle worker that's of God versus that one which is working the works of Satan? And it's based on, do they have us worship the true God and his ways? Notice it goes on to say, you shall walk after the Lord your God to fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and hold fast to him. No one else that says they're representing God, but asking us to break the commandments. That will be what the false religious system does and has done. But we are to keep God's commandments, and his voice we shall hear, and serve him and hold fast to him. Even at a time that's going to be great deception, we hold fast. Verse 5, but that prophet or dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken in order to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, redeemed you from the house of bondage, to entice you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk, so you shall put away evil from your midst. Now, in our case, God has brought us out of the world, redeemed us. He has freed us from the sin of this world. And the last thing we want to do is go back into it. But there will be enticements to go back into it, as we'll see as we continue reading. But Deuteronomy chapter 13 is a very important verse for us to consider at the time of the end, to identify the true from the false. Even though both are preaching, prophesying, things are coming true, and both are doing amazing wonders. Let's go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 8. We read earlier in 2 Thessalonians 2 last time, but we'll pick up in verse 8 now, speaking here about this system, this false religious system. It talks about a lawless one will be revealed. Again, talking here at the very end. A lawless one is referred to as a false prophet. We certainly associate that with the false religious system that will be in league with the political system in Europe at that time. It says, and then the lawless one will be revealed. Now, keep in mind lawless. I'm sure there will be laws, but it won't be in correlation with God's laws. It will be out of sync with that. The lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with his breath, with the breath of his mouth, and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So this is how we know that this is something that will happen at the very end, because it is Christ who comes back that destroys this particular lawless one. It is alive right at the very end. Christ comes back and destroys him. And verse 9, and the coming of the lawless one will be according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. And so there's going to be great wonders and signs, but it is the work of Satan. We're going to have to distinguish, not be impressed by signs, not be impressed by miracles, but it's the words they speak. It's the message they carry. Is it in line with Scripture? Verse 10, and with all the unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second and just say, I think this is vital for us. How much do we love the truth? We've been through situations, certainly back in 95, where we found that many people believed the truth, or seemed to at least, but on given the first excuse to eat lobster, to eat pork, the first excuse to not have to keep the Sabbath, they ran with it. And there were those who decided, I don't want to give this up. I'm not just going to fall for it just because I desire to go the way of the world. It seems as though many just wanted to live their lives the way they wanted to, and like the world does, be nice people, but not keep some of these food laws, not keep the Sabbath. They were just enticed by that. And I think that even if we understand these prophecies, even if we are able to identify the false religious system today and then, there could be an allure of just wanting to do our own thing, not having a love for the truth. Because to make it through these times, we will have to have that dedication, that not only an intellectual knowledge, but to want to believe it, to know it's true, and to want to live God's way, that we love it. We see the fruits of it. We've seen the fruits of it in our lives. We see the fruits of the worldly systems and where that's led, and we don't want anything to do with it. We must have a love of the truth that we might be saved. Verse 11. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, and that they all may be condemned who do not believe the truth, but have had pleasure in unrighteousness. Notice that strong delusion. There are going to be strong arguments against us. There's going to be spiritual influences that perhaps we can't imagine. It's trying to influence us to go a different direction, to lure us in. And we need to be aware of that so we can expect it. It's part of enduring to the end. We talked about that at our young adults prophecy weekend there, the retreat. Part of enduring is part of understanding how to endure is understanding what's going to happen, anticipating it, not being caught off guard and surprised by it, because there will be strong delusion, and it will be a lawlessness, not in line with the Word of God. We've got to be ready for that, to endure to the end. Notice verse 15 then of Revelation 13, back to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13 and picking up in verse 15. It says, he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So we see again this close relationship between a false religion and this end-time beast power that will be raised up in Europe. And I think it's interesting to consider, it keeps mentioning this word image. And looking back historically, it's quite astounding how the church at Rome, which ultimately became the Catholic Church, once it was accepted, once Constantine made religion the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church began to organize itself as a carbon copy of the Roman Empire. We have certain names even that's the same. We have the pontiff that you normally associate with the Pope, but the Roman emperor was called Pontiff too. And we have certain organizational areas that the Catholic Church, as it became to be known, organized just as the empire had, in districts and regions, parishes. And we see that today, even in Louisiana, you still have parishes. The political and the religious kind of overlaid each other, and we see an image of the Catholic organization was very much the image. The cardinals, their parallel was the Roman Senate. There's just so many correlations there. Pope Leo I admired the Roman Empire's hierarchy, and he was instrumental in beginning the shaping of the Catholic Church to resemble the organization and the hierarchy of the Roman Empire. To the extent that historians have commented on that, people who have no concept or clue about necessarily the prophecies and all. One of the prominent historians, Paul Johnston, I know many of you have read his books, but one of his books, The History of Christianity, he makes this statement. He says that the church became a mirror image of the empire itself. The church became a mirror image of the empire itself. And so we see this, like in verse 15 here, this concept of the image literally happened. And it only happened with one political and religious structure, one political entity and religious entity. It was the European revivals of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, and the church that was based in Rome, the Roman Church. So let's pick up then in verse 16. Verse 16, getting into this idea of the mark. Now, I've gone through everything we've gone through. We're leading up to this idea of the beast, but also the mark of the beast. We're going to get into that here, but first I thought it was very important to understand the beast, where it comes from, how we understand where it has come from and come to be the way it is at the time of the end. How Daniel prophesied these empires. So we have a better grasp of what has come before. We understand this beast much better, who animates the beast, Satan. And so we come to this idea of a mark, which has intrigued people throughout the ages. Verse 16, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, so everyone, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. I'll just pause right there and just say, just keep in mind here that it's the ones who can buy and sell are those who have the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So there evidently is various iterations of this. It is a mark. Sometimes people have just associated with some kind of tattoo or a marking of some type on the flesh. It is a mark, but the Bible doesn't require it be a physical, literal mark. And the fact that it says the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name seems to be more of an association with this evil empire, an allegiance to, a willingness to yield to it in ways that cause us to break the law of God. Now, I say that, it may not be a literal mark. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're familiar with the words of Deuteronomy chapter 6 about teaching our children. But notice what it says here. Deuteronomy chapter 6, and we'll pick up reading in verse 6. And these words which I command you today, you shall be in your heart. So in other words, not just something that is external, it's in their being. And you shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign. Notice this, bind them as a sign on your hand, and that they may be frontlets between your eyes and on your forehead. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now, the idea here isn't that it has to be something literal on your hands and between your eyes. It basically means everything you do with your hands, everything you do should be in line with the words of God. Everything you think should be in line with the Word of God. It wasn't, and I know that over the years people have literally done the frontlets and literally bound things in their hands and on their doorposts, but the idea seems to be more, I mean, what's the use of having it on your hands and here and on your doorposts if it's not in your mind and guiding everything you do? That's the ultimate purpose, to guide what we think and what we do. Who cares if it's literally on our body, if it's literally on the doorpost, if we're not living by it? God wants it to be in our heart. And that's why he says in verse 6, the words I command should be in your heart. It can't just be on your hand or on your forehead. It can't just be on the doorpost. It needs to be in your heart. But as a symbolism here of the idea that everything we do and everything we think. And this could be in relation to as well, and Revelation chapter 3, where it says you receive a mark on your right hand and on your forehead. In other words, whether it's a literal mark or something else, it affects how we think and what we do. How we think about, let's say, the beast power, whether we are in full submission to it, what we think and how we act, what we do. So that seems to be the important part of this. I recognize that it's fun to speculate about numbers and all that, and there is a number, definitely. But and we'll talk about that. But the key here is that we do not depart from God in His way. And it's going to be difficult because you can only participate in the economy if you have the mark. Now, talk about an enticement. You can justify that, people have justified over the years, well, I can't keep the Sabbath because my job requires it and God expects me to provide for my family. And that's, yes, He does expect us to provide for our family, but is that the only way? It's easy to justify not keeping the Sabbath because God wants us to provide. Well, usually there are other ways to provide. We don't have to compromise God's way to do that. Might we be enticed at the time of the end because we can't at least participate normally and fully in the economic system of the day? Might we be enticed to say, well, it's okay if I give in a little bit here? And I think these warnings are making it clear, no. If we give into that, it's the same as worshiping Satan. It's not just the government. It's not just a religious system that in many ways seems very good. It is Satan that's behind these things. And so we're going to have to make sure we see it as black and white. No, I can't. We will find other ways. God can provide with the birds of the air if he needs to, as he has before. We have to have faith at this time. But there will be a tremendous urge for many because, to participate in the system, you've got to have this mark, whatever it is, whatever identifying factor it is. It mentions here about the number of the beast, 666. Let's read on in verse 18 then. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Again, this has caused much speculation over the years. And we wonder what it is, and rightly so, because it's important enough for him to say, let him who understands calculate the number. We should not overlook that. We just have to be careful, because over the years, there have been people who've come to, I think, erroneous conclusions, because anything that's associated with commerce and has a number must be satanic. Therefore, early on, the idea of having a credit card that has a number and allows you to participate through credit in the economy, well, that could be the mark of the beast. But we know that we can buy things on our credit card, pay it off, and it doesn't affect our allegiance to God in one bit. It doesn't seem to have any kind of impact. It's not forcing us to break God's commandments or give allegiance to anyone, except sometimes debt if we overspend. But the idea of a Social Security number, well, you got to give that if you're going to get a job, and that means it's affecting our income and participation in the economy. Again, nothing about the Social Security number causes us to have to compromise our beliefs. I think it's such an important aspect to consider. That is the ultimate thing here, is this beast and this false prophet deceive so that we begin to worship image of the beast, idolatry. We begin to break other of God's commandments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Now, I want to talk more about this concept of the number of the beast. Again, it could be a physical thing, but it's well. Let's also read a couple other scriptures before we get to that. Revelation 16. If you flip over there, we talk about those who do receive the mark. It's mentioned in other places in Revelation, and there's a great warning because, as I said, there will be an enticement to receive the mark, so that we can do business. But there's great warnings associated with this. Revelation 16, beginning verse 1. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the seven angels, "Go pour out the bowls of the wrath of God on the earth." So this is the final wrath where God intervenes and starts to judge the world after the tribulation, just before Christ returns to Jerusalem. It says, "So the first went out and poured out his bowl on the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon the men who had the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image." So maybe early on we're able to participate in the economy, an economy that probably at that time will be probably roaring pretty good, because it says when this beast falls that the merchants of the earth cry, they moan. Apparently there's a great deal of wealth associated with this beast power. To participate in that, we have to have this mark. But God's wrath comes upon those who have the mark. In this case, loathsome sores and boils. And so we have to keep in mind that there's punishment to those coming. And that would be us too if we give in to that. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4. Revelation 20, verse 4. Revelation 20 and verse 4 says, I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was committed to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus, for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or his image, nor the beast nor his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads, and on their hands, that they should live and reign with Christ 1,000 years. So we give up our reward if we have the mark of the beast, this mark on our foreheads or in our hands. And chapter 14 as well, Revelation 14, just picking up another place where it talks about this mark and those who worship. Those who worship, specifically those who worship the beast. It says that those who worship the beast and the image of that beast will not reign with Christ 1,000 years. And we talk, Revelation 14, beginning verse 8, talks about those who worship that beast at that time. It says, the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and the image, and receives his mark on their forehead and on their hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. So again, there's tribulation from God coming, and judgment from God. He shall be tormented with the fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. They will have no rest day or night who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. Verse 12, here is the patience of the saints. In other words, those who aren't doing that, here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So notice there's a difference between those who receive the mark, who worship the image and the beast, and those who keep the commandments of God. So we have traditionally taught, and I think rightfully so, that this mark will in some way entail not keeping God's commandments, or at least one or more. And as I've said earlier, there's this idea of worshiping an image of the beast that is idolatry, and that seems to be one that's clearly stated here, the idea of giving into the concept of idolatry. And as I mentioned earlier, within the early Christians in the early Roman Empire and during the Roman Empire, they were told and expected to worship the emperor. It was a big part of, again, why they were persecuted early on. And that, it seems, will happen again to some extent. So idolatry is a big part of it. There could also be the concept of the Sabbath too, though. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Could this mark of the beast, the ability to participate in the economy, could it be associated with giving up Sabbath? You can't receive the mark, you can't worship the beast unless you don't practice the Sabbath day. We've traditionally taught that it probably plays a role in that as well. And I think historically, when we look at some of the things, we find that may be true. Go back to Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31. Speaking about the Sabbath here, it's interesting that all the way back to Moses' time, the Sabbath is referred to as a sign. And the idea of being able to work, when you don't work, when you do your commerce, so to speak, is associated with that, all the way back to Exodus chapter 31. Picking up in verse 12, Exodus 31, verse 12. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, for whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done 6 days. So it goes on to this has to do with you're working, earning a living. That's 6 particular days, at least part of those days, but not the Sabbath day. And so there's a sign associated with the Sabbath that could, again, come into play at the time of the end. Are we accepting the sign or mark of the beast? Or are we going to have the sign that we are God's people, that he is the God that sanctifies us? Not the false God, that's behind the false religious system, Satan. If you look back again at history, Constantine in 321, he declared that Sunday was to be kept. Now, a lot of times I think people think it was the religious authorities and the popes, but it was Constantine who decreed that people rest on Sunday, all the way back 321. And this is what he wrote. This is Constantine's decree, March 7th, 321 AD. On the venerable day of the sun, that's Sunday, let the magistrates and people reside in their cities rest, and let the workshops be closed. So they were to rest in the cities on Sunday. It was an edict. It was a decree from the Roman emperor. It says, in the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it is, as it often happens, that another day is not suitable for grain sowing and vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost. So, the farmers can do what they do. They don't have to rest on Sunday. City folks, you got to rest. We need the food. And, we can't rely on God to provide that if we might miss one day a week. So we'll let you guys go ahead and do your farming. So we all have food, but everyone in the city is going to have to rest. And then beyond that, even though Constantine started it, that decree that was to be the case, the Catholic Church claims authority to declare binding various holy days, including Sunday. It is a mark of their authority that they can decree certain days to be kept and others not. And they approbated the pagan holidays to make them, quote, holy, and in their mind at least. Now, Pope Gregory I, we're coming all the way to he reigned from 590 to 604, so around 600 AD. We have Pope Gregory who issued this statement. Gregory, servant of the servants of God, most beloved sons of the Roman citizens, it has come to our ears that certain men of perverse spirit have sown among you some things that are wrong and opposed the holy faith, so as to forbidding any work being done on the Sabbath day. It's come to my attention, somebody's teaching these false things, these terrible, perverse things. It says, what else can I call these but preachers of the Antichrist? Those who teach Sabbath should be rest, are the Antichrist. That might be looked upon again as the way people who keep the Sabbath are seen. It says, what else can I say but these are preachers of Antichrist, who when he comes will cause the Sabbath day as well as the Lord's day to be kept free of all work. For because he pretends to die and rise again, he wishes the Lord's day to be had, because he died, resurrected on Sunday. He wants people to keep Sunday in all reverence, but because he compels the people to Judaize, that he may bring them back to the outward rite of the law and subject to the perfidy or the deceitfulness of the Jews to himself. He wishes the Sabbath to be observed. So, according to Gregory, the Antichrist would teach Sunday and the Sabbath. Well, the church teaches Sunday, so the distinction here is someone would come preaching the Sabbath. It would be the preachers of Antichrist. Now, these are very bold words. That's why people who kept the Sabbath and even tried to do it secretly, if you closed your shop on Saturday, people suspected you of keeping the Sabbath, you could be put to death upon being suspicious of keeping the Sabbath. And so we see a long period of time where the Church of Rome had control, where those who kept the Sabbath, and even sometimes those who refused to eat unclean meats, because the church, along with the Jews, were persecuted for many, many times. I want to read to you here another canon. This is Canon 29 of the Council of Laodicea. This going backward to 364. It says, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's day. and if they can, resting then as Christians. But if they shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. So this is the historic stand, and none of this has been repealed. This is the historic stand of the Church, Church of Rome, and what became the Catholic Church. So these are some of the reasons that we see that the Sabbath, which has been a major part of persecution in the past, a major sign of those who were, in their mind, of the Antichrist, could become a mark again, a sign of those who are of the Antichrist. And so it's something to keep in mind as well. I think if we go back to, well, I've already read Deuteronomy 6, but if we go back to Exodus chapter 13, well, actually, I'm just going to, it just brings up the same point. The sign, a sign, well, let's go there. It's interesting. Exodus 13, beginning verse 6. It refers to the days of unleavened bread and how what we do on the days of unleavened bread is a sign. Exodus chapter 13 and beginning of verse 6, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So we're talking here about the days of unleavened bread. And the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leaven shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among all your quarters. And you shall tell your sons in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did when I came up out of Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand and a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. So notice this idea of keeping the days of unleavened bread is a sign on our hand and between our eyes, on our forehead. Now, we don't put the days, how can you put the days of unleavened bread on your forehead and in your hand? Well, you don't literally do it. It's a sign on your forehead and on your hands because it affects what we're thinking and what we're doing. Obviously, unleavened bread picturing ultimately not thinking sinful thoughts, but not doing sinful things with our hands. It's symbolic there. There's no way you can put the days of unleavened bread literally on your forehead or hands. So that's why one of the reasons, too, we come to the idea that this mark may not literally be something on our forehead and hand, but it is something that is very much associated with disobedience to God's commandments. And so I think it's this idea of the mark, counting the number of the man. Historically, that 666, even in the time just after John wrote this, Irenaeus and as reported even Polycarp believed that number added up to what was equivalent to Romans. Latinos is the word. If you take that in the Greek, Latinos, which is basically Latin man, or it means Romans. We would refer to them as Romans rather than Latins, but it's the same thing to them. Latinos. If you take those letters, and each of those letters, as in Roman numerals, they're associated with a number. If you take those letters and the corresponding number and add them up, it comes to 666. And so even as early as the 200s or the 100s AD, we have evidence that they were associating that number with Rome. And I think in the end, that is the most fundamental understanding that's safe. For many, 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 many generations from the time of just after John died, and perhaps John himself, the number would have evidently been associated with Rome and been understood that way. Now, there are certain emperors, there are certain people whose name adds up, the letters of their name adds up to 666. And if you were to, I remember a gentleman saying that he had worked out the numbers of various people, and you can find all kinds of people who, if you give the letters of their name numbers, either in Latin or Greek or Hebrew, because you can do it in all three languages, in one language or another, it will end up adding up to 666. The way I look at it is this. I see the 666 referring to the Roman Empire and the beast, and giving our allegiance to the beast. If there is someone who's leading that empire, and if there's a great false prophet that's telling us to worship the image of the beast, and that person's name does not add up to 666, I'm not going to conclude it must not be the Antichrist, it must not be the beast. In other words, I'm going to give the fact that God may be referring to the Roman system, to that false system. Now, it's quite possible that, and I would say it could be probable as well, that the name of that leader does equal 666. I'm not saying it won't. I'm just saying if it's clear that who that leader is and the name doesn't, I'm not going to rule him out. Because the most important thing is not that identifying a person based on a number, it's a person based on their fruits. 666 may simply refer to as we said earlier, the idea of Latin man, Latino, in the Latin person associated with the Roman Empire. Again, that was the early understanding. So the big thing here is to keep in mind that the mark involves allegiance and obedience to a false religious system. That's the most important thing. A false religious system, and that religious system is asking us to give our allegiance to a false political system. It may be very alluring, but what we've read today, and as we've studied these beasts, and very clearly to me what they represent, in both the first beast out of the sea being empires of political and military strength, and the second beast in Revelation 13 being the false religious system that comes out of the earth that speaks pompous words. And even Daniel refers to that religious system, a small horn, he calls it. It comes up and uproots the first three horns that were before it. And he talks about that. And of course, we see that fulfilled in the fact that the Catholic Church and the Pope were instrumental in having the first three of the barbarian leaders of Rome thrown out. Justinian came in, reestablished the empire, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire. So even what Daniel wrote about this religious system, we see it happening historically. But we have to be ready, brethren. And I think in understanding this prophecy and understanding these warnings, it's not enough to just understand. We have to have a love for the truth. We may see certain details of prophecy play out in a way we weren't expecting, but it will play out according to prophecy. Our interpretation may have been a little askew, but the fundamentals are there, and that's what we need to focus on, is those fundamentals. And I hope in going through this, we can not only understand it and be ready for what's inevitable, but also remain faithful. The question came up at we talked about at the Young Adult Leadership Conference where we focused on prophecy, and how is it going to be? I mean, some of the young adults would ask, we don't see a great empire in Europe. We don't see a powerful false church, false religious system. In fact, Christianity, if it's associated with the Lamb, it's a false Christianity. Christianity is at an all-time low in many places in the world. Certainly Europe, it's going down here as well. How could we see this? We talk about these prophecies of an end-time military and political union, which we associate with the 10 toes, Daniel 2, 10 kings that are, in essence, overthrown and taken out by Christ when he comes. I think many of us see the political union coming together a little easier than we may see the influence of the church, because we do have the European Economic Community as it began the Treaty of Rome. We have a European compilation of nations that are working more and more closely together. And in the end, they give their power to what's called a beast, to one person who has control like an emperor would. Right now, there's a lot of democracies. How's this going to happen? And one of the things that I mentioned, keep in mind, this is all directed by satanic forces. Amazing things can happen, changes can happen when Satan is unleashed to have more influence. And so just because we don't see these, quote, 10 nations or groups of nations presently formed fully in Europe, we do see them heading that direction. They have been for a while. I'm personally convinced that the present war of Russia invading Ukraine has had a tremendous impact upon European leaders. We see that in the news, where they recognize more than ever that they can't just rely on NATO and American power. we may very well sit out an invasion of Europe. They don't know, so they want to build their military power. And I think what Russia's doing now is precipitating more and more of that attitude of we need to build our forces. There is also a concerted effort among some European nations to work more closely together. But I would, we keep an eye on that, because something can happen. And one of the big things that can create change faster than anything else, it happened with Mussolini, happened with Hitler, it's happened throughout history. When the economy falters, when people can't put food on their table, they don't care about having a vote. They don't care about democracy. If somebody can demonstrate and tell them that they will get them their food, they'll give all power. Change can happen very quickly when people don't have much to eat, and they just need a change. And so that is something that could very quickly, if the world economies falter, we could see change very quickly in order to prop up nations and prop up food supplies and that kind of thing. We saw that with the pandemic, with a lot of people willing to yield to greater governmental authority. And even in China in particular, even though they had that authority, they would literally lock people in their homes if they had COVID, and finally the people rose up. But that's during a relatively prosperous period. When economy turns, people's mind can change fast. What about the religious side? This is something that I think we should keep in mind, because typically religion and things go through phases. Even in America, we had the Great Revival. You'll have downturns, and then you'll have upturns. And changes are happening within the Catholic Church that could make it more liberal and acceptable to many people in the world because of giving up certain fundamental beliefs that they've had in terms of marriage rights, gay marriage, and other moral things, which they may capitulate on just to have more followers. But I anticipate, too, that the powers, as has historically been the case, the power that develops political power in Europe will see a benefit in incorporating the church. We have certainly seen that in Russia. Putin's political power being propped up hugely by the Russian Orthodox Church that preaches to follow him. It's astounding to see how that has paralleled what we see prophetically is going to happen in Europe. The Russian Orthodox Church preaches almost Putin as a savior. Get behind this military campaign. Let us build back up what we had before. There's a desire to have what was once Russia. And I anticipate there will be a renewed desire to have what was once the Roman Empire, because it's still looked upon with favor and as being the ultimate of all things. And so look for a political system that sees an advantage of having a religious system by its side. Look for a religious system that feels it needs a political system to gain more authority too. They both will work hand in hand because they can both benefit each other. And so again, it doesn't take a lot, just hit people in their back pocket and their food for major change to come. But when Satan is involved, major change can come quickly. And there is prophecies indicating that God will offer Satan more opportunity, restrain him less, so that he has a greater influence in the world. So look for that to happen. We certainly can see it happening with the politics of Europe, but in our minds, the most important thing isn't just what's happening there, but what's happening in our heart. Are we committed? Do we have a love of the truth so that when these great delusions and temptations to compromise comes around, we will hold fast?